We are joined by Grant Newsham, Senior Research Fellow of Japan Forum for Strategic Studies. Grant, Trump has been a long advocate of sharing the pie equally. He has been extremely vocal of cutting back on U.S.'s share of spending towards the defense bloc. And European leaders have also been critical of Washington's shifting objectives in Ukraine. So how do you think the relationship is going to pan out moving forward?
Well, it's going to take some adjustment, particularly on the part of the Europeans. Mr. Trump remembers what happened during his first term when he tried to get the Europeans to take their defense seriously, to increase spending. And increasing spending is just one part of it. You've got to get your military capabilities built up. And he was basically laughed at. He's not in a mood to be laughed at again. And he's a little bit perplexed that despite what the Russians have done in Ukraine, that even now, Europe is not spending what it needs to. It doesn't have the capabilities that it needs. There's a few exceptions like the Poles. But then when you look at a major nation like Germany and its defenses are just in miserable shape, that Mr. Trump is playing hardball. And you might use the other word, tough love. And when he says to the Europeans, you've got to get your act together, I think he's not joking. I'm not sure the Europeans quite believe it, quite believe that America just might be there, not be there to back them up. But this is going to be rough for a little bit until the Europeans actually wise up. But Mr. Trump is serious about this. It's not to say he's going to pull America out of Europe, leave it defenseless, but he is serious that they have got to do more in their own defense.
Right. Whether it's tough love or playing hardball, Trump is serious. And another key word in his foreign policy, though, is thwarting the growing Chinese threat. In his first term, Trump had tried but failed to bring China into nuclear arms reduction talks when the U.S. and Russia were negotiating an extension of the pact known as the New START. Now, that pact is set to expire in February next year. So how likely is that Beijing will join this New START pact this time around?
I don't think it's very likely. The Chinese have shown no real interest in participating in nuclear weapons limitations talks. They might once they get the number of warheads and the nuclear capability they want, but they haven't shown any willingness to cooperate, and I don't expect they would. I don't think much will come out of this, but it does give Mr. Trump sort of the moral high ground. You'll notice that he's talking about summits and three-way talks and reducing defense spending, reducing nuclear weapons. Well, that gives you a sort of a good perch from which to do some other things. But he, as I said, he's getting ahead of this, and he's putting the other side in a position where they have to either come to the table, which they probably won't, or just give him the opportunity that he can then do what's necessary to build up America and the free world's defenses.
Right. So as you said, Beijing may not join this pact this time around. But another key security issue is obviously the war in Ukraine. The Trump administration is appearing to accept some of the Kremlin's key demands that Ukraine should not join NATO or return to its pre-2014 sovereign borders. Now, how will this affect peace talks with Ukraine?
It's a little perplexing to some of the people who follow this. I presume the administration has a plan, but it is a little odd to sort of lay out your bottom line and what you're willing to give up from the very start. So I'm not entirely sure how this will play out. Trump and his administration are very serious about ending the fighting. And they think that if they can get that done, then it's possible for America to devote more resources to Asia, to dealing with China. But at this point, it's very much sort of feeling out the other side, saying what might be possible. But some of the language used about guaranteeing American troops won't be used in Ukraine, that Ukraine won't get any of its territory back, Ukraine won't be part of NATO. Now, this may be the reality, but it's really not, some would say, the best approach to go into some negotiations having really offered up what the other side wants.
Exactly.
So we'll see how it plays out.
Right. And do you think that the Munich Security Conference will be the best time for countries to be discussing this?
I think it is, and particularly sort of on the side meetings. And hopefully, one would like to think the Europeans in particular will sort of get the message that finally they have got to do something about their own defense. And this has been a sort of a multi-decade problem, like 5 or 6 decades, that the Europeans, with some exceptions, just have not taken seriously. But you'll notice at the Munich conference that there's a lot of countries that attend, including the Chinese, who are the main adversary. So in the basic talks, the main talks, I wouldn't expect a whole lot. But when it comes to, say, these side discussions, that you could see some improved understanding, particularly on the part of the Europeans.
And speaking of major countries participating, including China, Trump had previously suggested that Beijing could play a role in brokering peace in Ukraine. So do you see China's involvement in this process anyway at all?
No, I don't really. I think China has actually backed President Putin, or Mr. Putin, from the very start. And the U.S. administration, the Biden administration, was unwilling to admit this. But without China's support and China allowing North Korea to provide support for Russia, the Russians would not have been able to prosecute this war as well as they could. Russia is glad to have the United States distracted, Europe distracted, and thinking that they need China's help. But China does not have a constructive role to play in this, and I don't believe they intend to.
Mm-hmm. And before we let you go, I'd like to discuss how President Trump recently met with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. There they discussed deepening defense deals. And how would this affect India's relationship with Russia moving forward, given that Russia has long been India's biggest arms supplier? Will this affect U.S.-Russia relations in any way as well?
That's an interesting question. It just might over a long term, because the United States and India, I think the relationship, there's actually sort of a natural attraction there. These are two big free countries. And you look at what they have done together over the last 20 years, over the last 10 in particular, particularly on from the defense front, the U.S.-India defense relationship is much deeper than it's ever been, and it continues to deepen. By definition, this makes India sort of less of a partner of Russia. They're not going to turn Russia loose. But the U.S.-India relationship, not in defense, but also economic and also political, is one that does threaten, or it offers the opportunity of bringing together two major democracies and leaving Russia sort of out in the cold somewhat. I would note that it appears that the Indians are on the list now to get F-35 fighters, and that's a pretty good sign of just how serious and how much America values that relationship with the Indians. And I think Prime Minister Modi, he reciprocates this. It's a very interesting development, and a lot of what we talk about is negative these days. But what the Americans and the Indians have going is something that deserves very close scrutiny, and it's actually a good thing, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. As you mentioned, it is shaping a new type of world order based on a new set of rules for international security. Thank you. That was Grant Newsham, Senior Research Fellow of Japan Forum for Strategic Studies.